Before introducing our first speaker, I wonder if here at the end of our long year of series on hospitality, if we could express our thanks to Richard Carney for his long-standing, courageous, and heartfelt efforts to welcome the stranger here in Boston. I know Professor Critchley from only a single evening, which he probably doesn't recall, but it was at the home of my colleague Dave Rasmussen and Richard Carney, as they were two veritable Marthas stirring up a hearty, or attempting to stir up a hearty welcome for you. My husband told me not to go into the details.
I remember it very well to a certain point.
Since 2004, Professor Critchley has served as Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research in New York City. His website on Wikipedia makes it clear, though, that he's not an American, he's an Englishman in New York. He taught prior to that at the University of Essex and studied at the University of Essex and the University of Nice. His early work on the ethics of deconstruction, Derrida and Levinas, was one of the first efforts to point to the ethical dimensions of deconstruction. And I'll just read you a short list of works which he's published during his time in the US, which must have been some interesting years given that he came after 2001. First Things Merely Are, Philosophy in the Poetry of Wallace Stevens, Infinitely Demanding, Ethics of Commitment, Politics of Resistance, The Book of Dead Philosophers, I want to get that one, and then with Rainer Schurman on Heidegger's Being and Time. Please join me in welcoming Simon Critchley.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming. I'd like to dedicate this talk to Bill, from whom I've learned so much over the years. It's going to be fairly hardcore. At times, reading a classical philosophical text is like watching an ice floe break up during global warming. The compacted, cold assurance of a coherent system begins to become liquid, and great conceptual pieces break off before your eyes and begin to float free on the sea. To be a reader, then, is to try and either keep one's footing as the ice breaks up, or to fall in the icy water and drown. And both are possible, and both are sometimes appropriate ways of reading. This is true of every page of Heidegger's Being and Time. It's nowhere truer than the discussion of conscience in Division 2, which for me is the most interesting moment in Design and Zeit. I want to try and reveal where the ice breaks, for it's here that the question of the uncanny and the stranger will begin to make themselves heard. At stake will be bringing the human being face to face with its uncanniness, with the utter strangeness of being human. And thanks to David this morning, Dasein is the happening of strangeness. I mean, that's very much the thought. My title is, I love this title, The Null Basis Being of a Nullity, or Between Two Nothings. Snappy. And you need these quotes, because I'll be working very closely with these quotations. So you've all got those, right? Everybody's got quotations. As you all know, what Heidegger is seeking in Division 2 of Being and Time is an authentic potentiality for being a whole, which turns on the question of the self, not the subject, but the self. If Dasein's inauthentic selfhood is defined in terms of das Man, and this is something over which I exert no choice, then what Heidegger is after in Division 2, Chapter 2, is a notion of authentic selfhood defined in terms of choice. So, I either choose to choose myself as authentic, or I am lost in the choiceless publicness of das Man. Heidegger's claim is that this potentiality for being a whole, for being authentic, is attested to in the voice of conscience. Quotation 1, if we analyze conscience more penetratingly, it's revealed as a call. Dog-like bark. Calling is a mode of discourse. The call of conscience has the character of an appeal to Dasein by calling it to its own most potentiality for being itself, and this is done by way of summoning it to its ownmost being guilty. Conscience is a ruf, a call. The call is a mode of rede, discourse, talk, a silent call, as we will see. It has the character of an anruf, an appeal. An appeal is a summons or a convocation, aufruf, to Dasein's ownmost being guilty. As we will see, what Heidegger means by guilt, which is something closer to lack in the Lacanian sense, or indebtedness, rather than a sense of moral guilt or culpability. Heidegger insists that our understanding of this call, hearing this call, unveils itself as wanting to have a conscience, gewissen haben wollen. And adopting this stance, making this choice, choosing to choose, is the meaning of resoluteness, Entschlossenheit, or decidedness, or being determined, or possessing fixity of purpose. That's the basic shape of the argument of Chapter 2, Division 2, and the terminology used. Heidegger argues that the call of conscience calls one away from one's listening to the base self, which is always described as listening away, hinhören auf, to the hubbub of ambiguity. Instead, one listens to the call that pulls one away from this hubbub to the silent and strange certainty of conscience. The call, he says, is what calls from afar unto afar. It reaches him who wants to be brought back. A little perhaps like the daimon. To what is one called in being appealed to in conscience? To what is one called? One is called to one's eigene Selbst, to one's own self. Dasein calls, conscience calls Dasein to itself in the call. So, what gets said in the call? Heidegger's crystal clear on this. What gets said in the call is nothing. It's like Cordelia in King Lear. Right? This is quotation 2. But how are we to determine what is said in the talk that belongs to this kind of discourse? What does the conscience call to him to whom it appeals? Taken strictly, nothing. The call asserts nothing, gives no information about world events, has nothing to tell. Least of all does it try to set going a soliloquy in the self, to which it has appealed. Nothing gets called to this self, but it has been summoned to itself, that is, to its ownmost potentiality for being. So the call contains no information, nor is it a soliloquy, like the ever indecisive Danish prince. It is the summoning of Dasein to itself that occurs silently. This picks up on a remark on 271 that Heidegger makes. He says, vocal utterance is not essential for discourse, and therefore not for the call either. This must not be overlooked, he says. So conscience discourses in the mode of silence, in and as what Heidegger calls reticence, Verschwiegenheit, which is given an extraordinary privilege in the discussion of discourse in Being and Time. Reticence is the highest form of discourse. One says most in saying nothing. The logic of the call is paradoxical. On the one hand, the call of conscience that pulls one out of the immersion and groundless floating in Das Man is nothing else but Dasein calling to itself. Calling to itself by saying nothing. It's not God calling to me, it's not my genes calling to me, it's me, myself, and I. But this gets more complex. And this is where it begins to get more complex. Quotation 3. But is it at all necessary to keep raising explicitly the question of who does the calling? Is this not answered for Dasein just as unequivocally as the question to whom the call makes its appeal? In conscience, Dasein calls itself. Im Gewissen, Dasein ruft sich selbst. This understanding of the caller may be more or less awake in the factical hearing of the call. Ontologically, however, it is not enough to answer that Dasein is at the same time both the caller and the one to whom the appeal is made. There's a division in the call. When Dasein is appealed to, is it not there in a different way from that in which it does the calling? Shall we say that its ownmost potentiality for being itself functions as the caller? Indeed, The call is something which we ourselves have neither planned, nor prepared, nor voluntarily performed, nor have we ever done so. It calls against our expectations and even against our will. On the other hand, the call undoubtedly does not come from someone else who is with me in the world. There's the paradox: the call comes from me, and yet from beyond me, or over me. And this is very interesting. The call comes from me, Dasein calls to itself in conscience, yet it comes from beyond me or over me. Der Ruf kommt aus mir und doch über mich. It's this über mich, which is interesting, like the über ich in Freud, perhaps, which is translated poorly as the superego, which happens against my will and is something that I do not voluntarily perform. So Dasein is both the caller and the called, but there is no immediate identity between these two sides or faces of the call. How do we explain this non-identity of the caller and the called? How do we explain this division at the heart of the call of conscience, which is something that Heidegger says insists is something that everybody agrees we all hear? It's a separate talk. So how do we explain this division at the heart of the call? In Freudian terms, this is the division which is constitutive of narcissism in the 1914 essay, separate topic. In order to explain the division within the call, Heidegger folds the analysis of the call back into the care structure. The situation of Dasein being both the caller and the called corresponds to the structure of Dasein as both authentic and inauthentic, as anxious potentiality for being or freedom, and thrown not lostness in das Man, as truth and untruth. So, structure of care. Insofar as I am a thrown project, I am both the caller and the called. And this takes Heidegger back in a fascinating way to the discussion of uncanniness. This is where uncanniness comes in. It first appears in the discussion of anxiety in paragraph 40 of Being in Time. Heidegger asks here, what if this Dasein that finds itself in the very depths of its uncanniness should be the caller of the call of conscience? And this leads us to the idea of the alien or stranger voice, the fremde Stimme. And it's the same formulation that Nietzsche uses in the 1886 preface to The Birth of Tragedy. Again, that's another story. But if you go to quotation 4, in its who, the caller is definable in a worldly way by nothing at all. The caller is in its uncanniness primordial, thrown being in the world, as the not at home, the bare that it is, in the nothing of the world. The nothing of the world. There's no quotation marks in the German. The nothing of the world. The caller is unfamiliar to the everyday they self. It is something like an alien voice or a stranger voice. What could be more alien or strange to the they, lost in the manifold world of its concern, than the self which has been individualized down to itself in uncanniness and been thrown into the nothing? This is why the quotations are important, otherwise you think I was making it up. Yeah. The self is thrown into the nothing of the world, no quotation marks, and into that nothing I hear the silent call that strikes me as alien. Strictly speaking, and this is the thought that I want to tease out of these paragraphs, the self is divided between two nothings. The self is divided between two nothings, the nothing of the world and the nothingness of pure possibility revealed in being towards death. It's akin to being between two deaths in Lacan's 7R7, but perhaps even more radical. The self is nothing, but the question Heidegger's asking is, what is the self? The self is nothing but the movement between two nothings, the nothing of thrownness and the nothing of projection, which is to say that the uncanniness of being human, being a stranger to oneself, consists in a double impotentialization. A double impotentialization, a double nothing. At the core of this is an inquiry into the nature of impotentialization. Heidegger insists, quotation 5, that the uncanny call calls silently. 5, the call does not report events, it calls without uttering anything. The call discourses in the uncanny mode of keeping silent. And it does this only because in calling the one to whom the appeal is made, it does not call him into the public idle talk of the they, but calls him back from this into the reticence of his existent potentiality for being. We're called back from the nothing of the world into the reticence of our existent potentiality for being. When the caller reaches him to whom the appeal is made, it does so with a cold assurance, kalte Sicherheit, strong term, which is uncanny, but by no means obvious. Uncanniness then pursues Dasein down into the lostness of its life in the they, in which it has forgotten itself. And uncanniness tries to arrest this lostness in a movement that Heidegger will call in the next chapter of Being and Time repetition. It is only the self's repetition to itself, of itself, it's only in that repetition that it can momentarily pull clear of the downward plunge of das Mann. There is a repetition compulsion at work here. When the self ceases to repeat itself, it forgets. It ceases to be itself. I could say more about that. But Heidegger completes this run of arguments in quotation 6. The proposition that Dasein is at the same time both the caller and the one to whom the appeal is made has now lost its empty formal character. It's no longer formal as it is earlier in the chapter. And its obviousness. Conscience manifests itself as the call of care. The caller is Dasein which in its thrownness, in its being already in, is anxious about its potentiality for being. The one to whom the appeal is made is the very same Dasein, summoned to its ownmost potentiality for being, ahead of itself, the structure of care. Dasein is falling into the they as being already alongside the world of its concern. And it is summoned out of this falling by the appeal. The call of conscience, that is, conscience itself, has its ontological possibility in the fact that Dasein, in the very basis of its being, is care. So the call is entirely intelligible in terms of the care structure outlined in Being and Time. That is, as thrown projection or as falling factical existence. And we do not need to resort to other powers to explain conscience. We do not need to resort to God, as in, say, Paul or Luther, or an idea of public conscience or an idea of world conscience. Heidegger argues against those in this chapter. So what does the uncanny call give one to understand? Right? Guilty! I mean, guilty is the exclamation mark, page 325. What does the uncanny call give one to understand? Guilty. Dasein is guilty. What does this mean? The being of Dasein is thrown projection. Insofar as Dasein is, it always has its being to be. That is, its being is a lack. It is something that is due to Dasein, a debt that it strives to make up or repay. Attend to the monetary metaphors here. This is the ontological meaning of guilt as Schuld, which means guilt, wrong, or even sin, but it can also just mean debt. To be schuldig is to be guilty or blameworthy, but it also means to give someone their due, to be owing, to be in someone's debt. Schulden are debts which have, as Nietzsche shows us powerfully in the Genealogy of Morals, a material origin. Debts have a material origin in the nature of contract. I tried to analyse this at length in relation to Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. It will appear in next month's Harper's, an article about the recession, separate issue. But interesting the relation of debt in relationship to the recession. Life is a series of what on earth is going on down here? Life is a series of repayments on a loan that you didn't agree to with ever-increasing interest, which will cost you your life. It's a death pledge or a mortgage. As Heidegger perhaps surprisingly writes, although he too was writing in troubled economic times, life is a business whether or not it covers its costs. Page 336 of the entire. Debt is a way of being. It is the way of being, which is why credit and the credence in credit, its belief structure, is so important. Heidegger runs through various meanings of guilt in these pages. Guilt is understood as having debts, being responsible for or owing to another. I won't go into this now, but it's very interesting to watch Heidegger try to separate his conception of guilt from the usual concept of guilt as responsibility to others, or from any idea of guilt understood in relation to the law, or the idea of the ought, the Sollen, the Kantian ought, Hegel's critique of which Heidegger implicitly follows in these pages. What Heidegger is trying to get at, obviously, is an ontological meaning to guilt, and avoid the usual legal or moralistic connotations of the word. What he's aiming for is, if you like, a pre-ethical or pre-moral understanding of guilt, or perhaps an originarily ethical understanding of guilt. Can he do this? I don't know, but let's follow him a little bit further into the really wild pages of Being and Time, in my view. As Heidegger tirelessly insists in these pages, Dasein is a thrown basis, ein geworfener Grund. It projects forth on the basis of possibilities into which it has been thrown, which is to say that Dasein is a null basis. It's a null basis. He then makes the fascinating remark, and we need to go through this in the German, but we can't, but here it is in quotation 7. In being a basis, that is, in existing as thrown, Dasein constantly lags behind its possibilities. It is never existent before its basis, but only from it and as this basis. Thus, being a basis means never to have power over one's own most being from the ground up. One doesn't have power over one's self, over one's thrownness. This not belongs to the existential meaning of thrownness. It itself, being a basis, is a nullity of itself. Nullity does not signify anything like not being present at hand or not subsisting. What one has in view here is rather a not which is constitutive for this being of Dasein, its thrownness. The character of this not as a not may be defined existentially. In being itself, Dasein is, as a self, the entity that has been thrown. It has been released from its basis, not through itself, but to itself, so as to be as this basis. Dasein is not itself the basis of its being, inasmuch as this basis first arises from its own projection. Rather, as being itself, it is the being of its basis. Discuss. Dasein is a double nullity. It is simultaneously constituted and divided around this double nullity. This is the structure of thrown projection, the meaning of care, and the ontological meaning of guilt. That is, Dasein is guilty, it is indebted doubly. It is null at the heart of its being. It is essentially doubly lacking. Thrown projection means, as Heidegger says, das nichtige Grundsein einer Nichtigkeit. The null basis being of a nullity. The null basis being of a nullity. And this, lo and behold, is nothing else than the experience of freedom. Not the concept of freedom, but the experience of freedom. 331, that's that same quotation. Oh no, different quotation on 331. Let's skip over it. No, I've got to read quotation 8. This is what I should have done this. This will make what I just said crystal clear. Look. So imagine that I missed quotation 8. That's very important. Yeah, quotation 8. Not only is the projection as one that has been thrown determined by the nullity of being a basis. As projection, it is itself essentially null, right? So we have, on the one hand, the nullity of the nothing of the world, my thrown basis, which I have no power over. And on the other hand, the nullity of my projective capacity towards my potentiality for being, which is also null. This does not mean that it has the ontological property of inconsequentiality or worthlessness. What we have here is rather something existentially constitutive of the structure of the being of projection. The nullity we have in mind belongs to Dasein's being free for its existential possibilities. Freedom, however, is only in the choice of one possibility, that is in tolerating one's having chosen the others and not being able to choose them. In the structure of thrownness, as that of projection, there lies essentially a nullity. Right? So there's a nullity in thrownness, a nullity in projection. That's all I'm trying to show. This nullity is the basis for the possibility of inauthentic Dasein in its falling. And as falling, every inauthentic Dasein factically is. Care itself, in its very essence, is permeated with nullity through and through. Thus, care, Dasein's being, means as thrown projection being the basis of a nullity. There's my quote. And this being the basis is itself null. This means that Dasein as such is guilty. If our formally existential definition of guilt as being the basis of a nullity is indeed correct. So freedom, you can see, is the choice of one possibility, in choosing oneself and not the others. But what one is choosing, in choosing such a choice, is the nullity of a projection that projects onto the nullity of a thrown basis over which one has no power. So what is Dasein? Dasein is a double movement of nullity in relation to the nullity of a thrown basis of which it has no power and the nullity of a projection. Freedom is the assumption of one's ontological guilt, of the double nullity that one is. Heidegger goes on to show that this existential ontological meaning of guilt is the basis for any traditional moral understanding of guilt. His phenomenology of guilt, like Nietzsche's in the genealogy of morals, claims to uncover the deep structure of ethical subjectivity, which cannot be defined by morality because morality already presupposes it. Rejecting any notion of evil as privatio boni, Heidegger asserts that guilt is the pre-moral source for any morality. It's beyond good and evil. Is guilt bad? No, but neither is it good. It's simply what we are. We are guilty. Such is Kafka's share of eternal truth. Heidegger brings a large number of themes together in an enormously powerful way in quotation 9. He says, this is where we come back to uncanniness. Uncanniness at the beginning, now we're going to come back to it after we've gone through this strange analysis of the double nullity of Dasein. The call is the call of care. Quotation 9. Being guilty constitutes the being to which we give the name of care. In uncanniness, Dasein stands together with itself primordially. Dasein stands together with itself. It's a strange formulation, isn't it? What's uncanny is standing together with oneself. Uncanniness brings this entity face to face with its undisguised nullity, which belongs to the possibility of its own most potentiality for being. To the extent that for Dasein as care, its being is an issue, it summons itself as a they, which is fatically falling, and summons itself from its uncanniness towards its potentiality for being. The appeal calls back by calling forth. It calls Dasein forth to the possibility of taking over in existing even that thrown entity which it is. It calls Dasein back to its thrownness, so to understand its thrownness as the null basis which has to be taken up into existence. Dasein is this movement, this back and forth between the nullity of thrownness and the nullity of projection. This calling back, in which conscience calls forth, gives Dasein to understand that Dasein itself, the null basis for its null projection standing in the possibility of its being, is to bring itself back to itself from its lostness in the they. And this means that it is guilty. There's an awful lot going on here. Guilt has been shown to be the innermost meaning of care. Its very movement, its kinesis. And all Heidegger's trying to do here is to think kinesis, think movement, and think the human being in movement and as movement. This movement, the movement of throne projection, or what I prefer to call throwing forth, is the structure of the call, which calls back by calling forth, as he says in quotation 9. It calls Dasein forth to take over its potentiality for being by taking it back to its thrownness and taking it over. Again, look at the words here. Dasein ist der nichtige Grund seines nichtigen Entwurfs. It's the nothing ground of its nothing projection. It's a double nothing, a double zero. Dasein is the movement of thrown projection, which means that it is the null basis for a null projection. And guilt is the movement, the kinesis of this nullity. A movement back and forth, vor und zurück, to and fro, as Beckett would say. Such is the strangeness of what it means to be human, the uncanniness of being brought face to face with ourselves without reference to any external agency like society or God or whatever. The human being is the utter strangeness of action between two nothings. It is a potentiality for being whose sole basis, limit, and condition of possibility is a double impotentialization, which of course is also to say that it's a condition of impossibility for that, an existential quasi-transcendental. So what is the human? The human is the uncanniness of a movement of a double impotentialization. That's my formulation. Impotence, finally, is what makes us human. We should wear it as a badge of honor. It's the signal of our weakness, and nothing is more important or impotent than that. I've just finished a paper on impotence, co-written with my wife. That's on impotence in Freud. And if you like, Freud's thought is that impotence is basically the condition of civilization. I can say more about that in relation to his essays on the psychology of love. So the idea here is that what, so far from the, as it were, heroic virility of being that we're accustomed to think of in relation to Heidegger, potentiality of being, what underpins the Heideggerian project in Being and Time is a movement of impotentialization at both ends, thrownness and projection. And that's all the human being is. Heidegger insists that Dasein does not load guilt onto itself. It is, in its being, already guilty. Dasein is guilty always already. What changes in being authentic is that Dasein understands the call, understands the appeal of conscience and takes it into itself. Dasein as authentic comes to understand itself as guilty, which means that Dasein as potent comes to understand itself as impotent. Dasein as potentiality for being comes to understand itself as impotent, radically, constitutively. In doing this, Dasein has somehow chosen itself. Hat sich selbst gewählt. This is interesting. What is this choice? Because this chapter is all about choice. What is chosen is not if what we don't choose in living with them is not to have a conscience, what we choose is choosing to have a conscience, what Heidegger calls Gewissen haben wollen, wanting to have a conscience, a second order wanting, a wanting that wants the want that one is. So what one wants in wanting to be authentic is one wants the want that one is. I am wanting, right? I am radically impotent at the level of being. That's the thought. And I want that in the call of, in being authentic. That's what being authentic is. It's not driving a car well, like Draper's thinks. You know? That's a bit bitchy, isn't it? Or playing basketball very well, whatever it might be. In quotation 10, the last quotation. So, in wanting to be the want that one is, this is making a decision. It's making an ontic, existential decision, right, to be the want that one is. Heidegger says, when Dasein understandingly lets itself be called forth to this possibility, this includes its becoming free for the call, its readiness for the potentiality of getting appealed to. In understanding the call, Dasein is enthralled to its own most possibility of existence. It has chosen itself. It's chosen itself. And the last quote. Wanting to have a conscience is rather the most primordial existentielle ontic presupposition for the possibility of factically coming to owe something. Factically coming to be in debt, right? Something which the graduate students here I'm sure are very familiar. In understanding the call, Dasein lets its own most self take action in itself. That's the phrase, take action in itself, in sich handeln, in terms of that potentiality for being which it has chosen. Only so can it be answerable or responsible. Verantwortlich. Heavy word, right? What's the thought here? Responsibility, answerability, originary ethics. Well, how do we want to finesse that? Let's just say responsibility, answerability. Consists in understanding the call, in wanting to have a conscience. And this choice, Dasein's choice of itself, is taking action in itself, in sich handeln, which reminds us of a phrase of Heidegger's of a later vintage, which of course runs in the following way, which you all know. We are still far from pondering the essence of action decisively. It is a word, action, that Heidegger both uses and continually reminds us that he wants to avoid using. In Being and Time, as Derrida has shown masterfully, and Derrida is, let's just remember, the best reader of Heidegger that we have, just in case we overlook that fact. The logic of Heidegger's avoidances is crucial here, right? It's a word that he avoids and uses. What might action mean, conceived of in relation to the double nullity that we've described? What might action mean? What might potentiality for being mean when its condition of possibility and impossibility is a double impotentialization? What might action mean in such circumstances? To perhaps anticipate another talk, such a conception of action might be called tragic. Might be called tragic. Introduction to Metaphysics would be a way of thinking that. The reading of Oedipus and Oedipus Rex and Antigone. I prefer to call it tragicomic. As one of Beckett's gallery of moribunds, Beckett, 3 lines out. As one of Beckett's gallery of moribunds, Molloy asks himself, tongue deep in his cheek, from where did I get this access of vigour? From my weakness, perhaps. And it's in relationship, hopefully you can perhaps see what I'm up to, opening the door to a slightly heterodox reading of Heidegger that would ultimately open into the question of the tragicomic. But that's another question for another day. Thank you for listening. Yeah, Richard and then Jack.
Just to tie it up with the theme of the conference, hospitality. The notion of uncanniness as Unheimlichkeit. Dasein is not at home in the world. Okay, it's in a sense uncanny because home. So my question is this: is Dasein capable of hospitality to the stranger? To come back to 2 quick quotes from the first page. In Conscience, Dasein calls itself. The call undoubtedly does not come from someone else who is with me in the world. Thirdly, the caller is unfamiliar to the everyday. They self, it's something like an alien voice. Mm-hmm. Now, the like an alien voice interests me there because I just wonder...
Like the voice of the friend in Division 1. The voice of the friend that Dasein carries. Right. Yeah.
So, is there really an alien in Heidegger, apart from an authentic Dasein that calls to the Dasein lost and thrown in the world? Mm-hmm. In other words, is there a radical alterity, or is there not what Heidegger in one paragraph calls existential solipsism, that the Dasein is actually still caught up in itself to the extent that it's calling itself back. It's the other in itself that's calling itself back to authenticity, as a being towards death who totalizes itself in and through death. So where I would ask, in this world, in this ontological world of Dasein authentically calling and answering itself, where's the homeless one? Where's the migrant? Where's the outsider? Where's the foreigner? Where's the widow, the orphan, and the stranger? I mean, are these just ontic persons that Dasein can never care about as others? Or is there, do you think, a real ethic of hospitality in Dasein and in Heidegger?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know, honestly. It's obviously I've been influenced by Levinas's criticisms of Heidegger, and in a sense I'm trying to shape those up in this reading. That's what's going on behind the scenes. I mean, the way the argument goes in Being in Time is that being towards death has these four criteria, the most important of which is non-relationality. Right? It's my relationship to my death, and dying for another or another's death cannot be a substitute for that. Right? Making myself a sacrifice isn't going to work. Heavy word, sacrifice. Another's dying is not going to, the death of Ivan Illich, that's not going to do it. So it's non-relational, and conscience by a fortiori is non-relational too. So going back to what David was saying this morning, we have a non-relational understanding of finitude and a non-relational idea of conscience. It's only in relationship to the strangeness that I am to myself that I can then be, as Heidegger says later in this chapter, become a conscience of others, or a conscience for others. So the move, it's Heidegger's sort of monistic logic, in my opinion, which I think in this reading begins to try and prise open. We begin from the one of Das Man, right? We move to the one of the constancy of the self, constituted through ecstatic temporality, and then we go in paragraph 74 to the one of the folk, right? The one of the people. So it's a 1-1-1 logic. Right? Heidegger's difficulty is counting to 2. Right? And so Levinas's entire critique is the need to count to 2. That's what Levinas calls plurality, which is always misunderstood as Arendtian plurality. It's not that, it's plurality within being, that my being is split between me and the other. Now, I'm trying to push hard at these bits of Being in Time, because I think the ice flow, that, as it were, autarkic logic of Being in Time begins to come apart a little bit. But I take the point. Jack was next.
Thank you. That was really exciting. 2 points. One is, why are you leaving out falling? I mean, actually, the nullity of Dasein is threefold. It's not a double, it's a triple nullity. It's a triple movement. Kinesis is a tripartite movement. It's a triple impotentialization, which hooks up with the tripart structure of time. So it's, all the 2s should be 3s as an exegetical matter.
I take that point.
Secondly, I agree with you about halfway, and that is, I think you've identified the text which pivots you into the later Heidegger, or Heidegger 2, or whatever you call this, because it de-centers Dasein to a certain point, up to a certain point. The half, I don't agree with you with, and maybe this is, you don't even agree with yourself when this point is, all of this impotentialization and nullity is the seed of heroic Dasein. It's in the face of its nullity that it chooses, in the very teeth of death. So this doesn't diminish the heroic character. It's the scene of it.
It needn't diminish the heroic. What could be probably tragic in that sense would be the assumption of that impotentiality, the assumption of the want that I am in wanting to have it. That would be one interpretation of what Oedipus does in Oedipus the King. He would see that. another part of me wants to connect this with, a different understanding of finitude that I associate with Beckett in particular. Okay? An idea of finitude as a sort of falling away. There is rapture, or there ought to be, in the movement Crutches give. Or the moment when Sucky Moll and Hairy Mac are trying to, let's say, make love. It's not Beckett's word. Both of them aged and completely impotent. Him putting his sex into her, folding it in half like a pillow slip. And he said, and somehow from this situation they were able to extract something resembling pleasure. And McMahon learned the meaning of the phrase, "to his company." It's that idea of "to his company" that's very much on my mind. So it's that tragic, comic dimension of Heidegger. But I think, what you say is right. This doesn't, you can see the way this sets up a heroic reading as well, which is what's going to happen in the next chapter of this discussion of ecstatic temporality. I just find this moment just, in Division 2, Chapter 2, just a moment where things begin to loosen up.
Simon, could we just maybe one more question?
Sure.
Bill should be taking over.
It's two of you.
I mean, if you want to take the two of them,
Let's
and
take
just
the-
respond briefly.
Mine's quick. Simon, where's home?
Where's home?
You described Unheimlicher, the structures of
Liverpool.
Unheimlicher in the double. In other words, there's an emphasis on the I don't want to say pathological, but it's not tragic, it's traumatic, what you're describing. You're describing an existence that is tortured, between the two nullities.
Mm-hmm.
And my question, like Richardson, is where's it's not just Unheimlicher, it implies that there's got to be a home somewhere. There is a place where we can live and dwell and be, that is not necessarily traumatic.
Yeah, that's life with Das Mann. That's what
so
we
it's
have
got
to.
So only on authenticity is
That's the
possible.
canny, right? That's the
So
familiar.
there's no possibility for living outside of trauma.
No, but
authentic
that's
way.
what we do. Heidegger's point is that's what we do all the time. We live completely fascinated by this world that we share with others. That's which is indeed relational, rich, and meaningful.
Heidegger kind of implies it's a fool's paradise. The one.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I take seriously the claim. That it's not making a moral valuation here. Inauthenticity is not bad. Inauthenticity is a way of being. And people have seen through that for 70, 80 years in a sort of knowing, wry way, wave their copies of Adorno and the rest at that point. But if we really take it seriously, we would then say, well, inauthenticity is where we are, that's home, right? That's not going to go away. Authenticity is just the wanting to want the want that one is. One sees that for the nullity that it is, and one for a moment can pull away from it. Master the everyday, Heidegger, but never extinguish it. We go back to it. So that's, you could say that's the cave as well. That's Heidegger doesn't think.
Maybe one sentence.
I
Question
think
and reply.
I think you've been seduced by Levinas's critique of Heidegger, and that you're replicating that today. When Levinas says, that being towards death, the problem is it's always my death rather than the death of the other, which I should be focusing on. And you giving us a sort of existential solipsism here. And I think I would turn it right round. I would say if you look at Heidegger's discussion of authentic solicitude, of the equiprimordial Mitsein, that is part of what Dasein is, and inseparable from him. And the different ways in which you can relate to the other, authentically or inauthentically. The question of my relation to my death is quite central in the kind of relation I can have to the other. If I relate to the other authentically, I don't just go in there and tell them what the answer is, how to solve their problem. I give them their freedom back to them. In other words, he's using his account of what
That's
it is.
Division 1, Chapter 4, right?
He's giving his account of what it is to understand my own mortality, and using that as a way of understanding how I need to treat the others in relation to their mortality. Now that seems to me wholly different from the account you're giving of this Dasein as enclosed, focused on their own death. This is an opening to the other's mortality, and is central to the way he understands authentic solicitude.
Simon, can we leave that as a comment? And
I'd be perfectly happy to do that.
and continue it afterwards. Thank you, Simon.
It's difficult to introduce Bill Richardson, especially under tight time constraints, but he's something of a mythical hero already here at Boston College, having come here first in 1981. So he's taught here for over 25 years, and prior to that at Fordham for 17 years. He served as Director of Research at Austin Riggs Center, and he also served as the rock on which we built our psychoanalytic studies minor here at Boston College. I'm especially appreciative of the numerous times he retooled his graduate seminars into the undergrad courses that we needed for the minor. You have my gratitude for that, Bill. I'm going to read to you. I asked Bill just to send me a short statement about his interest, which he did immediately. And I think he probably spent 2 minutes writing it, but it told me something about the precision with which he always works. So here is his own statement of his interests. He's interested in the philosophical dimension of the role of language in human beings, especially insofar as the use of language in the talking cure may sometimes relieve some of life's inevitable tensions. I like them. 2, I'm currently interested in the role he is of desire in delineating a so-called ethics of psychoanalysis, and here we see some of the disagreement with Lacan that he is working through in his own work. Of course, we should mention too Bill's monumental Heidegger through Phenomenology to Thought, and his working through of Lacan's thought in Lacan, Language, A Reader's Guide to It. Now we look forward to hearing his paper, Chasing Shadows, Welcoming the Uncanny. Welcome, Bill Richardson.
Thank you, Vanessa. And thank you, Simon, for the high compliment you paid me in offering that gift that you just gave us as personalized for me. I'm very grateful and very honored by it. I'd like to say briefly that I've been wanting to get involved in what you were saying, and obviously thought better of it. And I'd like to say that I admire your paper immensely. It was very powerful. But I think when push comes to shove, I'm on David's side. I think you forget, just to say it briefly, I think you underemphasize the mid-side character of Dasein from the very beginning, and I think that does alter, it seems to me, the reading of some of those texts. But it was a superb presentation, and I'm much honored by it. That said, we come to the final word. And I must say, we're all glad to get a final word when it comes. I've often thought about the inebriated person who was told once, come on now, you've had enough to drink, now it's time to go home. And he said, enough? Perhaps too much, but never. And so we come to that moment when never enough is here. And I'm honored to be invited to say a word, even if it's the final word. I must say that I approach the task in a somewhat non-phenomenological way, in the sense that I'm part of the phenomenon. That is to say, the phenomenon includes this entire process that began not at 11 o'clock this morning, but it began at least in January, several months ago, and indeed the thinking about it began a long time before that. And the dimension of that project is one that I find impressive, if not to say daunting, And because what Richard proposed to us all, and that to which we are coming to a close right now, reads this way, and I'm editing this down for the sake of time. Most philosophical attempts to understand the role of the stranger, human or transcendent, have been limited to standard epistemological problems of the minds, metaphysical substances, body, soul, dualism, and related issues of consciousness and cognition. This seminar intends to take the question of hosting the stranger to the deeper level of embodied imagination and the senses, in the Greek sense of aesthesis. It will ask such questions as, how does the embodied imagination relate to the stranger in terms of hospitality or hostility? Given the common root of hostis that we heard allusion to this morning from Jeff, as both host and enemy. This was a study of Benveniste, with which Richard started the entire project, and indeed he insisted on the ambiguity of the word hostis and the duplicity that's involved. And my first reaction was, now there's a problem. And unfortunately, with a one-track mind, that remains the problem. And as we've passed through the intervening months, I've thought to myself, with great admiration for what's been done. It's been remarkably done. But we're just chasing shadows. You know, the real problem is that ambiguity or that ambivalence in hostis. And that has bothered me ever since, and it remains the one problem that I would like to address this evening, so that afterwards we can at least talk and say, well, at least what you said, at least address the problem, as I understand it to you. In any case, the question comes down to, says Richard, it will ask such questions as, how does one embody the relationship to the stranger and hospitality and hostility? Okay, we've just mentioned that. We discern between projections of fear or fascination, leading to either violence or welcome, that's that ambivalence. How indeed do humans sense the dimension of the strange and the alien in different religions, arts, and cultures? And therefore we come, and how then do we deal with the perception of alterity and verticality, which operates as an affective, pre-reflective, pre-conscious level? And then we're into psychoanalysis. And what, finally, are the topical implications of these questions for an ethics and practice of tolerance and peace? That indeed was the project, and you must admit that it was and remains very ambitious. And when we talked about the logistics and prospects, I was told, and I've learned that this has been verified since, that these are the details. There were 60 participants, 30 students, graduate and undergraduate, and 30 faculty, drawing from 14 different disciplines, from psychology and philosophy to education and physics. Collaboration with 6 Boston area universities, including MIT, Harvard, Brandeis, BU, Smith, and the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And the guest book and guest box designed jointly by MIT, Media Lab, and the BC Film and Fine Arts Department, which will be in part of the series of interreligious and intercultural, and I add international performances, liturgies, literally, with Glenstall Abbey coming up in July, and in Ireland, and then in the following year, if all goes well, in Bangalore, India, at the Bangalore Intercultural Center in 1910, where these public performances of what we are doing here this afternoon will be given a public exhibition in another language and in another place. Now you've got to admit that's something to talk about. I must say from the beginning I was a little skeptical, and I had the bad grace to tell Richard, Richard, this is crazy. But if you bring it off, you'll make Bernie Madoff look like a pike. So bringing it off is what we come to now in a kind of a final word, but as you see what we're doing this afternoon is not a final word at all. So I'm going to respond as best I can in the spirit of my own presence in the seminar. That's to say, to react to what seems to be the key problem and ask your help to tell me whether the problem is worth addressing and whether or not addressing it this way is of any help. Because I'm very aware of the limitations of any help that can be offered to the problem that Richard posited in the beginning. How do you explain the same word, hostis, can mean at the same time hospitality and at the same time enmity? How do you get the two together? How does that possibly make sense? That said, I tried to do my best to find some kind of, this was all audio-visual, you understand, so I was trying to find some recent audio-visual material that would pose the problem of the uncanny. Mind you, the uncanny was a title that was given to me simply because I used the word uncanny in a conversation with Richard, which I was trying to express my gratitude for something he had done very graciously for me. And he said, uncanny, that's the word. This is what you'll talk about in the seminar. So the term uncanny was not of my choosing, and I'm doing my best to make sense of having it to talk. So I tried at least to offer some visual aids to start with, and I thought to myself, now what film is there around that one would call uncanny? And I thought to myself, well, Benjamin Button would be a very uncanny type of thing. A man grown old and grows young. And then I thought to myself, but who wants to talk about Kate Blanchett as an old woman, or Brad Pitt as a squalling infant? You know, this is a fantasy of F. Scott Fitzgerald that should have been left with F. Scott Fitzgerald. At any rate, it's not an example of the uncanny. Another example that was recommended to me was this film called Moonlight, which is a film about an investigator who is basically a vampire and falls in love with his victim. Now, I thought that might be interesting, but I was told that it's the kind of film that the father of a 13-year-old girl ought to see with her father, and it would do them both good. And I thought to myself, well, yeah, that's very nice, but yeah, I've never had a 13-year-old daughter. Richard, I swear, I am not now, I have not been, I have never been the father of a 13-year-old daughter.
I didn't recommend the film, Bill.
How universal can that be? Certainly the uncanny is more universal than that. But then, a week or two ago, I woke in the middle of the night and unable to sleep. I turned on the radio and got the BBC. And they were intervening someone who had just finished a film called 50 Dead Men Walking. And this is, she was the director or the assistant to the director, and this film was about a man in flesh and blood called Martin McGartland. Now that's his real name. Martin McGartland had been recruited as a teenager in Belfast to become a spy for the British Army as amid the IRA. He did this, he was probably trained, and he was very successful for about 4 years. And the consolation that he got was, well, 50 men are still walking today because you paid us this service. Now, the unfortunate part was that the IRA found out about this, and they tried to make short shrift of Martin McGartland. They captured him, they tortured him almost unto death. By some quasi-miraculous way, he jumped out of a car over a bridge and fell into the water, to the river, and was able to escape. So he's alive and breathing now, ready to talk about his experience, which must have been excruciating, and has published a book upon which this film was based. Now, the director was saying what a fine job they had done in getting the picture of the troubles, as they're called, from both sides. And she indeed had engaged the confidence of people both in the IRA and the British to talk honestly about the way they felt about things. And she was very happy about the fact that the film was not tendentious. That it was a fair picture of everything, that they hoped it would do a great deal in the healing process as time went on. And as they were cutting the film, she had news over the air that the IRA had started up again by shooting a couple of policemen in Belfast. So this was last summer. And she described the feeling and said, "Oh, no." She said it was an eerie feeling that we had, that doing everything we had been doing, and still the whole problem was still there, rotting. And we just held up. Is this going to start up again, as was the general question? And happily, it did not start up again. Happily, for all concerned, the general public said, no, we've been that way and we're not going back that way, happily so far. So it seems to me now, her use of the word eerie corresponds to what I think the word uncanny really means. It's a normal symbol, synonym for the word. So I'm taking that as an example of the uncanny. And if you notice what it is, that she was working on something that was very, very carefully done, with every effort at objectivity to the extent that that's physically possible, and had succeeded, it appeared. And then this sudden news came and shattered, or seemed to shatter, because of this doom or blackness which was in her consciousness and the consciousness of everybody, that had been repressed, but hopefully gotten past, but nonetheless was real enough to really give her the shivers. And that's what I think is the uncanny. The happy phrase of Julia Kristeva is to translate the uncanny as l'étrangeté inquiétante. Not traumatisante, but a strangeness, for whatever that can mean, that is disquieting, upsetting, but it's not traumatic. Okay? It's not utterly destructive. So there's a kind of mixed knowing there. There's a knowing of this darkness, and a certain old apprehension is stirred by reason of it. And that stirring is called the uncanny. Now, that said, that's an empirical example of, I think, what I think the uncanny is. The really important sense of the word the uncanny comes from Freud, of course. Well, let us say his development of it. Freud developed this late in his career in 1919 between the pleasure principle and the ego and the id. He was at the height of his speculative powers in terms of the metapsychology that he was talking about. And he took his source from a book by the name of a man by the name of Jensch from 1908, entitled The Psychology of the Uncanny. Now, Freud remarks the fact that it's strange that the uncanny, although we can trace the roots of it all through the history of thought, nonetheless had not become a theme for psychological reflection until this book in 1908. And it was on the basis of that book that the article on the uncanny by Freud was written in 1919. Now, the book actually is based upon an analysis of a tale by E.T.A. Hoffmann, who wrote several tales, who put to music by Offenbach. We used to hear Offenbach's tales of Hoffmann. And one of the stories is a story about a certain Nathaniel, and the gist of it is, this is called The Sandman. Now, I remember being home with a young family, and the boy was 5 or 6, whatever. He was allowed to stay up because company was there. And he began to yawn, and she said, oh, Sandman's coming. Sandman's coming. And he kind of smiled and realized the fact of life. And so my sense of it was a kind of a cheerful story about a Sandman. And the sense of it was that the Sandman just does come, he throws this dust in your eyes and makes you sleepy, yes, but he also makes you dream. And it's a wonderful dream, you wake up in the morning, everything will be great. So it's a fine bedtime story, except that Nathaniel asked his mother to explain it, and she said, I don't know. So she passed it on to the babysitter who was coming in, the rest was going to take care of him. And the babysitter said, well, you know, the real story is that the Sandman comes and he takes out people's eyes. And he takes them up and he puts them in a big bag and he takes them up to his hiding place behind the half moon in the sky. And that's pretty scary stuff. So Nathaniel said, well, he was going to stay up and see what this Sandman was like, you know, and defend himself if necessary. And in fact, he did see, first he heard a heavy clam, though a heavy-footed person came up after he was in bed and went in to see his father. And they closed the door and they muttered quietly between them. And that was already suspicious. But the worst part of it was that he kept coming back night after night, always going to the father, always talking darkly, always carrying something in his sack, and heavy-footed and sort of ominous. And soon enough, the father died. My memory is that he was killed, but certainly he died. So we had this combination now of a boy wondering about his fate of his eyes, and also combined with an experience of the father's death. And he apparently got past that particular crisis, but when he got into university, he had trouble with his eyes and went for an examination, and the trouble came again, and the old anxiety reemerged. Now that's the basis of Freud's analysis. And the substance of it was, therefore, that this would be an example of the uncanny. And Freud tells us this, after going through it in detail, and he had already gone through a long explanation of the meaning of uncanny and so forth. But what he comes down to is saying this. It's a long and careful analysis and worth reading, of course. But the heart of it is this. At this point, I will put forth two considerations which I think contain the gist of this short study. In the first place, if psychoanalytic theory is correct in maintaining that every affect belonging to an emotional impulse, whatever its kind, is transformed if it is repressed into anxiety, then among instances of frightening things, there must be one class in which the frightening element can be shown to be something repressed which recurs. So what we have here now, the repressed experience of childhood is recurring now at the occasion of a medical examination. This class of frightening things would then constitute the uncanny. And it must be a matter of indifference whether what is uncanny was itself originally frightening, or whether it is carrying some other affect than simply that. In the second place, if this is indeed the secret nature of the uncanny, we can understand why linguistic usage has extended das Heimliche, the homely, into reality, nothing new or alien, but something which is familiar and old established in the mind, and which has become alienated from it only through the process of repression. This reference to the factor of repression enables us furthermore to understand Schelling's definition of the uncanny as something which ought to have remained hidden but has come to light, unfortunately. This then is the structure of the uncanny as Freud sees it. There is a primal trauma of some kind which is kind of repressed, but not to the extent that it is not does not return by recall, except with any more distance than the attempt to repress it gave. In other words, sort of on the fringe of consciousness which is retrieved. And therefore one can speak of a kind of dual knowing. There is a knowing of what happened originally, which is canny enough, but the fact that it was insufficiently repressed and comes back again by a trigger of some kind, as it happened to the university student Nathaniel, there is another kind of knowing. And that second kind of knowing is uncanny. In any way, the word canny and uncanny has a sort of slippage between them that is based upon a kind of knowing that is only partially repressed. Now, I find that relevant to that case of the 50 Dead Men Walking. There is a darkness experienced, but still on the fringe of consciousness, and it comes to awareness on the occasion of this coincidence, unsurprising fact that the IRA kicked up their trouble again. Therefore, I'm taking that to be an example of the uncanny, at least as Freud understands it. And I only would add to that the notion of canny and uncanny here is sort of mixed in with the dubious character of the phenomenon. It's not a real, complete repression, it's just a partial one. But it's enough to give the shivers and uneasiness, connaissance inquiétante, as anyway, a commentator on the notion of the uncanny as it appears in Freud was simply underlines what I'm trying to say, that the German words heimlich, homely, and unheimlich, unhomely, are loosely related together to heimisch, native. And heimlich then can mean familiar, intimate, and cherished. But its other definitions shade into the apparent opposite significations, such as weird, concealed, and secret, and threatening, and dangerous, and therefore ominous in the sense. So there is an ambiguity even in the word uncanny, as and he goes on to say. Thus, heimlich is a word the meaning of which develops in the direction of ambivalence until it finally coincides with its opposite, so that linguistically what is heimlich can thus become unheimlich, and for Freud this ambiguity is a constitutive feature of the special core of feeling that he characterizes as the uncanny. What I want to insist on is simply that the very notion of uncannity includes the same ambivalence that we talked about earlier in the relationship that included in the word hostis, which can be both friendly and unfriendly, and they hear both canny and uncanny at the same time. That's the only point I want to make at this moment. Now, you will say, well, yes, what's this got to do with welcoming the stranger? I haven't the faintest idea. But that's what research has yielded. Now, to take one more step, and this will be my last step. Freud did not have the last word. Of course, he's been replaced, or he's honored now as the second Freud, the French Freud, namely Jacques Lacan. And the question is, does Jacques Lacan have anything to say that about the uncanny that could be helpful here? I understand that Lacan is a conundrum, and I'm also aware that many of you are specialized in him. So I hope you'll forgive me if I go through the basics of Lacan, simply so that the cards are all on the table and we can talk about the problem that emerges. Who was Lacan? Well, you know, he's born in 1900 and matured around the 40s. And he had approached Freud in a new way. He was impressed by the fact that if you take the early works of Freud, the real works of creative genius, like the interpretation of dreams, the psychopathology of everyday life, and dream and jokes and the unconscious, what Lacan notices that they're all filled with plays on words, with curiosities that come simply in the way Freud uses language. And so that Lacan's argument was the real Freud is there in the early works, namely his fascination with language and his power of analyzing language in such a way that it can prove helpful to people who understood it. Now, Lacan will say the reason why Freud gets caught up in all this hydraulics, you know, repression and conversion and all that sort of thing, is this was the only language he had coming out of the late 19th century that was intellectually respectable in the community from which he came. They were the scientific community. So this was the language that was available to him in 19th century mechanics, and therefore this is what he used to try and articulate the nature of the unconscious. Whereas Lacan would say, yes, but from 1915 or 16, we have a new science of linguistics, which inspired the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss. And therefore, we have a new instrument for analyzing language and using it scientifically. And therefore, let us see what we can do with that. That then is his orientation. His fundamental paradigms then come down to this. Mind you, he's trying to be reinterpreting Freud. He remains a Freudian to the core. But the language, the categories that he introduces to work with are three, which you're familiar with, I'm sure. One is the symbolic, one is the imaginary, and the third is the real. Now, the symbolic is the world of language, and the systems of language, and the functions of language, and the uses of language, and the difference between language as system and language as practice, and all that sort of thing. You can see it goes a long way. And Lévi-Strauss certainly took it a long way. And what Lacan would say is, I'm just doing, for psychoanalysis, what Lévi-Strauss has already done for cultural anthropology. Whereas the imaginary is the imaginary that we have been hearing about all semester, namely the embodied imagination with all that implies. And I understand the embodiment would include imagination, would include the conscience incarnée of a Merleau-Ponty, who would perhaps insist on a certain dimension of that embodied imagination. And in any case, that's what is meant by the imaginary. Basically, it's a relationship one to one. That is to say, if I pick this up, my imaginary relationship is a one-to-one picture in my mind or my eyes for this particular object. Whereas language introduces a third dimension. It's not a one-to-one relationship, but we bathed in it. But that's the major difference. But the real, what is the real? The real is the impossible, he says. The impossible to be reproduced by or represented by either the imaginary or the symbolic. And that then becomes a problem. What is the real for Lacan? Because if it makes sense, this is the arena where I would like to suggest that there may be a relevance for meeting, encountering the stranger in psychoanalytic terms. Now, if you let me present this material as I would want to a group of people not as sophisticated as yourself, I want to explain briefly what I thought Lacan was about. I'd asked them if they ever been to the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, and many, of course, hopefully would say yes, of course. And it seems to me that for me personally, was an experience of the uncanny. And the reason is that that's this 246 long black onyx piece of stone has inscribed on it the names of 58,000 and more, 1,000 people, 58,000 men and women who died in Vietnam. And the wall is so polished that it really serves as a mirror. You cannot look at these names. Well, I knew, or felt that I knew, all of those names. At least their names were familiar with people that I had known and did know, people that I had gotten to know because I was teaching at the time. They were names of students, that I knew. And I had talked to the students, as many of us who were around at the time did, and talked to them and tried to counsel them as they faced the problem that you will recall, namely, should I be a conscientious objector? Should I go to Canada? Should I go to Sweden? Should I serve in the army? I don't believe in this, and so forth. And so these people were fresh and blood for me. I knew the names, I knew their background, I knew the inside of them all as well as some of their parents did. And so when I saw those names, they're talking about real people for me. They're just not a list of names of Civil War dead. This is real flesh and blood. But and that for me is the symbolic. Because captured in those names is the entire symbolic order and its representation in their lives. But beyond that, this black onyx background was, as I say, mirror fresh. So it was impossible to look at these names without seeing a personal reflection of myself, which was not very attractive, because it was the same self that had known those people. But I only recognizing it now imaginatively. It's an imaginative reflection. It's the same self that knew those people and the same self looking at them now. So looking at yourself in the mirror across the stretch now, maybe 20 years, and realizing that you talk to these people and try to teach them, and they're silently shouting at you, and the image in that black onyx reflection is you. Where were you then, when they were dying? And where are you now, that they're dead? What about you? And that was a chilling experience. Beyond that, the onyx itself is just black, Without its reflection, it's just black. And the blackness itself represents the entire darkness of that dreadful time. And those of you who remember that time know what a dreadful time it was. And it was a quagmire indeed, for reasons you don't need further explanation from me as to its meaning. But so for me, that all was disappeared not into the politics of the time, that was only part of it, but the entire darkness that Vietnam suggests even today. It's suggested today by the same feeling of 9/11. how do you put 9/11 into words? It is a fact, a dark, ugly fact that is the real. At least my understanding of the real. And I have to tell you that I'm not a very tearful guy, but I began to cry at that experience and found a place discreetly apart and sort of cried it out for a while. Just thinking of these people and thinking, what have I done with my life since, to be faithful to them and to the countless others who went through the same trauma. At any rate, that for me is the experience that I count as genuinely an experience of the uncanny, because of the details I've given. It's a relatively modest excitation that comes, that awakens a deep, deep traumatic experience that's never been resolved, really, in terms not simply of the war itself, but in my obligation to these students. And we always look back and think of what we could have said and didn't say at a time when it could have been crucial. That said, what does Lacan have to say about this? Well, I want to talk not about the language of Lacan or the imaginary in Lacan, that would take us a long way off, but just about the experience of the real. He talked about the real as soon as he began to lecture in 1953. And it's there by indirection into the late 50s, into the seminar on ethics that we were speaking about earlier, where he talks about the real there in a rather unusual way. And he talks about it not as the real, but as the thing, the thing. This will bring up echoes to what Simon just said, and will spark a lot of discussion, the notion of the uncanny, as he presented it so well. And in the ethics, he, for the first time, talks about the real as thing, And he comes to that by making the analysis of Freud's project for scientific psychology, which takes us back to 1895, 5 years before the interpretation of dreams. And there, Freud is trying to analyze, it's a work of genius, it's a work of madness, but it's pure genius. And he's trying to describe the way a child learns to understand and to talk. Apropos what was said this morning, I found that very, very relevant, what you were saying, to this particular phenomenon that I'm about to describe. Because Freud is trying to describe how a child learns to understand things in terms of his own body. It's his only instrument for comprehensibility. And Freud described it this way. It sort of pops up unexpectedly, but this is what he says. He prefaces it by saying, really, the only way a child understands. Am I being heard? The only way a child understands is to interpret what it apprehends in terms of what it already understands, in the terms of the experience of his own body. And therefore, this is the only language he has, and therefore he absorbs it into the language of his body, or he doesn't. So, having said that, Freud continues, the same will be the case with other perceptions of the object. Thus, for instance, if the object screams, a memory of the subject's own screaming will be aroused, and will consequently receive his own experiences of pain. Now, how the mothering one, let's assume it's the mother, should scream in such a way that it would need interpretation by the child, that's left to our own fantasy. But he continues. Thus, he says Freud, thus the complex of the fellow creature falls into two portions. One of these gives the impression of being a constant structure and remains as a curious thing, in quotes. In German, als Ding, T-I-N-G. While the other can be understood by the activity of memory. That is, can be traced back to information about the subject's own body. And the context that, and he's often wrote. He's saying that Freud is suggesting there that there is an experience of the other, the mothering one, the body caretaker, as a thing, a structure, somehow unified, but nonetheless not interpretable in terms of the child's power of comprehension, that is to say, in terms of his own body. Therefore, there is ingredient at that very moment an experience of the separation of the infant from the mother, an experience of the other as, first of all, other, and other in no other way than the fact that it's something there, it's a thing, and no more than that. Nothing to identify it, nothing to describe it, no way to interpret it, it's just the other as such. Now, this experience of the other is, first of all, this is Freud extrapolating in subsequent texts, and also Lacan commenting on this phenomenon. His first experience, therefore, is the of das Ding as other, and therefore as strange, and therefore as empty of meaning, and therefore as foreign, and therefore alien, and because of the difference alienating, continues to be the other of the child, and it contains at the same time not only an otherness, but the mother, I'm assuming the caring person is the mother, but the mother is experienced as completely other. Antecedently, the mother was part of the imaginary child of the world in which she was identified with the mother as part of the wholeness of life. And now, so that with this experience, this mother is separated from the child and, for all intents and purposes, lost to the child. Because now, with the child's experience of otherness, this other is no longer what it was, and there's nothing more than an emptiness for the child. There is a lack, there is a loss. So that this primordial experience of the child is an experience of loss, but of absolute loss, because it was the loss of anything that could give meaning eventually to a child. A child is stuck with a thing, and nothing to help it but language and imaginary to try and capture it. And basically, that's all that language can do. It can try and grasp the real, can try to articulate the real, can try to make accessible the real, but it has no control over the real. The real, as I understand, as I'm understanding now, obviously I'm talking about the way I understand, the real is that Ding. It's completely indifferent to any nuance that language can give to it. So much so that if you take this at its bone, it comes down to even the words good and bad are extrinsic to das Ding. It is beyond the language of good and evil, and that's beyond good and evil. It is just das Ding, the thing. It is therefore if I may just continue this by a clumsy impulse that I put my hands on something, it's as if the mother and the child were counterparts, you know? And at this moment of scission between them, the mother is separated completely, so that absence constitutes an emptiness in the child. Not only an emptiness in the child, but the mother remains an object, but a lost object. Mm-hmm. So that the experience that follows is that the child's search for other objects are really a search for this lost mother. And I'll turn it up to say that the mother is no more than a lost object that really was never there in the first place. She didn't pretend to be and never thought to be the wholeness of a child's experience. So the mother too is sort of an empty receptacle for this thing, and a deposit, if you will, a place to deposit all the wishes and hopes and dreams of the child as it pursues its own way to try and make do in this world in which it is found. Now, just to put this as briefly as possible, there is the rest of this world, of course, for the child who, for the moment, is your humble servant. And the fact of the matter is that as the child grows, of course, other desires come aboard, at least other objects come aboard, and so when we get to the university level, like Nathaniel and the people that we deal with almost every day, we ask students, they have sets of desires or drives, if you will, drives that cover, say, well, there's someone that wants to get married, and that's part of his world, and this one wants to finish his PhD, and that's part of his world, and this one wants to get a job so he can sustain himself in studies, and they can eventually get married. It's in this situation, I'm sure we're all familiar with. Now, all of those, call them desires, if you will, I call them drives, if you will. All those drives pursue certain objects, as you can see that, or detail that. They pursue certain objects, but those objects are pursued under the guise of some kind of an infiltration into them of the desirability of the lost object. So that the lost object is now considered to be the supreme lost object, the archetypical lost object, because it includes them all. Now, let me say one word to supplement this. This original separation between this lost object of mother and the subject itself, and the subject itself, of course, is totally lost, empty, is pursued, as I say, by the pursuit of these different objects that constitute our daily world. It's as simple as that. But what makes those objects attractive and useful is the fact that the original lost object, the mother as lost, infiltrates all the objects that we pursue to supply to them their ultimate attractability. So that all that the child is looking for in this search for the objects of satisfaction and the objects of need as we experience them are some way of replacing in some tentative fashion what was lost by this original capital loss or profound loss that constitutes the original scission, if you will, as total as the cutting of the umbilical cord, but now that is lived and articulated as the pursuit of the lost object. Now, let me add one other significant thing. This loss of object, namely mother as totality, realistic or not, this loss of mother is a loss for the child, and therefore it's a lack in the child. The child certainly is a child in want. It is in want of food, care, and attention, as Richard alluded to this morning. And that want means that it is a being in want. But this wanting is what of the lost object, the wanting for that lost fulfillment, this is what's meant by desire. It's basically a lack, a radical lack, a totalizing lack. I'm tempted to say substantial lack, but it's the last thing you want to call it. The child had a substance at this point. But a total lack in the child's being, and that lack in the child's being becomes a wanting, so that the one thing embodies the entire child, and that one thing is a one thing for this lost object. And all the other objects that we address, of any kind, share in the wantedness of the lost object. So that the lost object infiltrates all of the objects of our pursuit and limited desires, desire for marriage, desire for study, and so forth. So that desire, therefore, is called, this lost object is referred to by Lacan as the cause of desire. And, as Pagelian term, there's no problem with that. But the fact of the matter is the only reason for this desire, the only focus for desire as a human being, is the lostness of this object that is now summarized by Lacan by the word, the letter A's, old name first. So it's referred to as l'objet petita. The totalizing cause of desire is the lost mother, and that is the cause of desire and its means of sustainment. That said, there are two things that I will insist on. But, one long time, but I would much rather finish up and quickly, and so that you can have a chance to poke out at him. This experience of das Ding is an experience of lost fullness, that's sure. It's an experience of desire, but it's the experience of the lostness of a mother. So there's a primary and primordial experience of attachment that has been interrupted. So that's part of the experience. So there is the element of a fullness that's lost, but retained at least as a kind of residue, and the experience of loss itself. So that original experience combines the ambivalence that we find when language takes over and finds ambivalence in a word like hostis, or ambivalence in a word like the uncanny. That says what is worth. There's one more point to add. Well, 2 points. What's the function of psychoanalysis? It's to find out what your desire is and take account of it and act accordingly. It's a little bit like the notion of authenticity in the economy. And therefore, if your analysis leads you to saying that this object that you're seeing, this lost object, really never was anything and doesn't mean anything now, then a successful analysis would be to face up to that. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Your desire is empty. Now live with it. Or you can look at that, say, no, there is always the words of Augustine, until I rest, there will be no rest indeed, because there is a fullness, even though experience is lost, nonetheless it can be achieved. Now, given those are ways of dealing with it, but in any case, whether we deal with it that way or not, the relationship to the other includes this experience of alienation that is potentially pejorative, that is, say, demeaning. And it can take on those aspects that Christela describes very well of the abject, because once you get on the slippery slope of the negativity of interpreting the ding, then you can include anything in it that is horrible or disgusting and the like. Therefore, if that's the case, then a mature person who knows this much and knows that what's true for myself is true for you, then let's face the fact that there is in both of us a root of disgust, a root of irreconcilable difference, which constitutes individually the risk that's involved in dealing with someone else who's contaminated with the same kind of inescapable poverty and finitude that describe the experience of thus being explained. So that the very least that one can say, it seems to me, in terms of facing the other, is to recognize the fact, look, between us, you know, there is this risk which was insisted upon so clearly this morning. But that risk is inevitable. And the only way that we can get along at all is to see the risk and take the risk. However, taking the risk may mean. So this problem about the perfidy of the neighbor and the potential assassin and so forth, or disease, well, that's part of the risk, you know. And it takes upon, it gives the responsibility of the one taking the risk to look at the risk and say, no, it's not worth it. You know? For example, taking a trip to Mexico at the present time, it's just not worth it. So there's a way of responding to this mutual poverty that consists in being the thing character that's ingredient to all of us and transcends any attempt to posit it or to reconcile it or to civilize it with the language of good and bad and the images that go with it. Now, is that acceptable? Well, that's my question. But that's as much as I can say about the danger that's involved. It's ineluctable. The risk that's involved is ineluctable. And it's at that point when one makes a prudent judgment, as our friend Aristotle says. That said, there's only one more point that's worth making, and that is to come back to the role of desire. For a Lacan and a carrying Lacanian, desire is nothing much more than the desire for a lost object, therefore a desire for an emptiness, and the only thing to do is recognize that life is a desire and a pursuit of what is ultimately emptiness, and make what you can. But the other attitude is, we heard this afternoon, an attitude which is not that. That even as discreetly as you want to put it, can find some source of meaning for life and fullness out of emptiness, that finds another kind of other than Lacan talks about, and that philosophers normally avoid simply because it becomes a non-philosophical experience, so to speak. And that is the experience of the divine, of the possibility of love, which has a ground in some otherness which is beyond human experience, and or at least to deal with it the way the non-Christian religions do, and they're sort of making do with the toughness of life and the tragedies of life, and find nonetheless a way to adjust to that with peace and tranquility. So that at this point then, I really come to my final word by presuming upon what was said this afternoon by the previous speakers. They did speak rather freely about the possibility of God. I would not presume to do that myself if they don't set the tone as saying it's one acceptable. That's an acceptable approach in the context of this. But in any case, we can talk about, at least in philosophical terms, about a desire which we would like to call a philos of Sophia. Let us say a desire which we would attribute to a man like Socrates, you know, a desire which he'd be willing to call an eros, or a love, and the love that impassions philosophers, really, who really are such, is the love of that kind of wisdom, a kind of truth, which another revelation will say this love is love of something actually divine. So it's in that spirit then that I like to close with a few words that are very, very meaningful to me personally. And I'd like to address this to the many graduate students in particular who helped Richard through this enterprise. I myself was a great admiration of that. I've known some of them in class, and they are indeed admirable people. And not simply for their talents, which are extraordinary, but for the generosity and the fidelity and perseverance with which they've helped Richard bring this about. And to them and to all the other philosophy students here, I'd like to say that even if you cannot accept a notion of love as T.S. Eliot does, as somehow of a divine source, the love that brings you to philosophy is love indeed, and it's a love that Socrates certainly experienced, and would honor in you, if you cannot move beyond this, as we all do. Eliot finishes Little Being, and after looking around the world, it's at the end of the four quartets. He says, the only hope, or else despair, lies in the choice of pyre or pyre. To be redeemed from fire by fire. Who then devised this torment? Love. Love is the unfamiliar name behind the hands that wove the intolerable shirt of flame, which human power cannot remove. We only live, only suspire, commanded by either fire or fire. What we call the beginning is often the end. And to make an end, as we try to do tonight, is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. And so, with the drawing of this love and the voice of this calling, we shall not cease from exploration. And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started, and no other place for the first time. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Bill, for that wonderful talk. Vintage Richardson, that unique mix of the personal and testimonial with the philosophical and the analytic, as he helped us to understand the uncanny as this unhomeliness, this Unheimlichkeit, at the root of the two terms hostility and hospitality. I think it's very fitting that Bill had the last word in many respects, but in this respect, perhaps primarily, that throughout several of the seminars, we have heard from time to time, and very poignantly, of the dark, ugly facts of violence, of brutality, of barbarism. We heard it in the seminar by Regine Jean-Charles on the African and Asian racism, the barbarism of slavery and genocide in the history of America, and indeed of the West. We heard it in Pádraig O'Malley's talk, a talk of personal witness about friends and acquaintances shot in their beds in Northern Ireland, where he worked for many years. We heard it more recently in Noam Chomsky's talk about hostility and hospitality in contemporary world politics, where he came back again and again to the facts of horror, the facts of bloodshed, the facts of hostility. And the fact that Bill brought this question of hostility, the dark, ugly facts, what in another sense he called the real, down to another level, as I think most of the speakers did today, the ontological level of home and homelessness, that's unheimlich, the uncanny, or just now with Bill, taking us psychoanalytically to the roots of the real and the struggles of the imaginary and the symbolic, of our consciousness, of our representations, of our language, to try and deal with that. So I'm very, very grateful to Bill for bringing us to that space of reflection and, I hope, discussion. So we do have at least 10 minutes to take some questions from the floor. Simon? Not quite from the floor, but from the table.
About love, Bill. Does the experience of love require a divine source? Or is the experience of love in and of itself the only meaning that the divine has?
That's an easy one.
Philosophically, one depends on how you understand divine source. Philosophically, you need some source. And whether one identifies that source as divine or not, or some other kind of source, is not a matter of indifference exactly, but an indifferent question, I think, in terms of the question that you're posing. And the second part of your question was, is a belief in God, if I understood the question, Simon, that second part, would you rephrase that, please?
It's just the idea that whether love requires some sort of transcendent divine source as its basis, or whether it's simply the experience of love in and of itself that is divine. That's the issue, and I suppose my view would be the latter,
Sure.
for what it's worth.
Yeah. I would say it's a value in itself. And therefore, I would look upon its relationship to the divine in the sense of what it aspires to is more than lovers can promise to each other on the day they get married. As I say, I think the aspiration of love when two people really give themselves to each other, and to really give themselves, to give them with some permanence, with real permanence. If you're giving yourselves, it seems to me you're giving a future, but you may want to question that. At any rate, I would say you're giving your future to another person, and giving that future to another person is a giving of one's poverty as well as one's goodness. And that poverty is very often debilitating. And fidelity to that love, I think, is very hard on human nature as it stands, given the finitude with which we go through this. And therefore, I think that the aspiration of love to be permanent and to be faithful includes a recognition of one's poverty, and that recognition, that poverty, I think, would come from a recognition of some outside help to remain faithful to one's commitment. One cannot, one gets through life without awareness of that outside source, and I wouldn't attempt to speculate on how that commitment is supplemented invisibly by a divine source. I do think that the aspiration of love insist upon more than human frailty can offer and guarantee with any permanence. But not reach what's outstretched our grasp.
Okay, David and Ed.
Yeah. That was just wonderful to hear, Bill, and incredibly inspiring, I have to say. Your conclusion, just one step short of love, was that this repetition of the desire for this lost object is in some sense tragic and bound to fail, and which sort of takes us a little bit in the direction of the things that Simon was talking about.
Yes.
But I'm reminded, and this is something I want to put to you, of that point in Nietzsche's Zarathustra, where he's talking about eternal return, or eternal recurrence, which is itself a recognition of a kind of repetition, and says we do have a choice here. We can, as it were, just fall down and gnash our teeth and say, no, this is the most awful thing I've ever heard, and that direction is nihilism. And tragedy in a terrible sense. But he says there is another option, which is celebration and affirmation, and say, yes, this is what I can will. And I'm wondering whether that sort of option is a way out, not a way out, but an option for you. That is to say that you could say every time we pursue this illusory dream of something else that's beautiful, or another extraordinary possibility, that we are doomed, because every time it's just going to deceive us and fail us. But you could say, no, each time there's this beautiful dream, this possibility, this passion, and I affirm it each time, even if someone comes along and says to me, you're going to die eventually, or it's never going to work out. Can you not affirm the folly, if you like?
I think so. I mean, I think one can go with Nietzsche in that far. You go that far, you simply affirm the moment and rejoice in the moment. And yes, the power to rejoice in the moment, how it is symbol a lot of bad things in the past and maybe still to come, but a lot of good things in the past and still to come. And both together have made it possible for this moment now to take place. And yes, that makes sense to me. It makes sense to me. I don't know how much further I want to go on the implications that Nietzsche draws. I'm a believer, and at this point would want to explore Nietzsche a little bit further and explore further this notion of eternal return. I must say that it's a recent appreciation of that that's been given to me by dedicated Nietzschean to help me understand the beauty of the moment simply because it's now. There was a great dancer, and you all know his name, Nureyev, right? Relishnikov is called, but Nureyev. He was dying in the hospital of AIDS, apparently, and dying a very painful death. And he said at one point, yes, I know it's tough right now, but it's just so good to be alive. And I think there's that sense of the love of life that is communicated in the moment that you suggested. And yes, I would certainly honor that. I would certainly honor that and find as I do much in Nietzsche to applaud.
Very good. I think probably a last question from Ed, because we have miles to go and promises to keep him where it's after 6 o'clock, so perhaps this could be the last
so
question.
Bill, in this talk, which deeply moved me as well, I detected a complexity of motives. It seemed that on the one hand, you wanted to valorize the ambivalence, the bivalence, the duality of enemy, friend, of love and hate. This is really very classical psychoanalytic thinking, Empedoclean thinking. Freud himself cites it at one stage. By a move to another level, namely Das Ding, which seems somehow to, if not to undercut those alternatives, to complicate it enormously so that we can no longer say that this is the choice, this is the search. So it have implications for Heidegger, and I think in the very passages that Simon was quoting, Heidegger also often moving between authenticity and authenticity, nothing existence. Are you saying that the Lacanian wisdom, the late Lacan, is in some respects really undercutting or throwing into a light of, let's say, comparative superficiality, this preoccupation, which was that of Freud, that of many philosophers, that of many of us, of course. Or are you saying something else? I wasn't sure what the inner logic of your move was in the talk. So a little more about.
That's a very sharp question. That there was a double movement in the talk. That is to say, I wanted to affirm the philosophical and psychoanalytic validity of ambivalence in doesn't do. That's inescapable, I want to admit that. And on the other hand, and I believe that. But then, given that ambivalence and polyvalence in doesn't deem, prior to any intervention of language and imaginary language of good and evil, for example, I respect that and I honor it as a position that I understand and respect. But then you come to the question about dealing with it. And remember, Lacan says at one point, I think he was talking to the students at L'École Normale, I think, but on the question of religion. And he said, well, he says in several places, das Ding is that which doesn't work, And the trouble with religion, and he usually means Christianity, and even Roman Catholic Christianity, which he grew up with, which he always treats, I shouldn't say with disdain, but with disinterest. Well, anyway, I don't want to go into that. But he always says that religion, or he suggests that religion as a form of sublimation, shuts his eyes to the real and distracts us with beauty and harmony and all that sort of thing, But it never really faces up to the real. And the only other thing to do is face up to it. And I deeply believe, if I can speak personally, I think that in Christianity at least, I wouldn't presume to speak for how other religious orientations resolve this question, but speaking, you're asking me personally, and I'm giving you a personal answer. In Christianity at least, it does not turn away from the real. I think that any kind of realistic assessment of the crucifixion, however you interpret it, and whether you insist upon the resurrection as part of it, at least to recognize that much in the crucifixion of someone who claims to be God and submits to this and accepts this, says yes to this, that's not avoiding the real, that's facing it. Especially when one's able to see that there's a way of living in union with that, through and suffering one's own life, which becomes quite real over time. So I think Christianity, at least, does face the real, so it's not true to say that it avoids it.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'd like to ask you to join me in expressing our gratitude to Bill and our other 5 guests today. Thank you.